To understand the basics of photography, we first must understand how light works. Photography literally means drawing with light. Photo means light and graphic means drawing. So photographic, drawing with light. As the sun shines, it shines light on all things. As these objects reflect the light, they absorb some of the spectrum. They might absorb the red and the blue and reflect back the green as in a leaf. These photons just go everywhere. And some of these photons enter our eyes. And our brains will translate this into what we see as an image. A camera works the same way. It takes in these photons and focuses them into the camera, and instead of sending it to a brain, it sends it to a film, or in today's camera, to a digital sensor. The workings of a camera, especially the things we'll discuss in these videos, including aperture and shutter speed, also work similar to our eyes. To understand how things focus in a camera, you can actually do this with your own eyes in the real world. If you bring your finger to your face, but so you can still see it, and you focus on it, you'll notice that the background blurs. If you try to focus on the background, what happens to the finger? The camera has a similar issue when it's trying to focus on something close or far away. Aperture is how big or small the hole is in the camera, and this lets in more light or less light. Just like when we are trying to see something at night, our pupils actually get really big to let in more light so we can see. For those who have not experienced this, you should go into a dark room after being outside and you'll see that you can't see anything at all because your pupils are still small and they're starting to get bigger. As they get bigger, they let more light in, and then you can start seeing a little bit in the dark. Vice versa, if you leave that room and go into a bright room, you'll feel the pain of your pupil trying to constrict to try to limit the light. In a camera, if we leave our aperture too big, we'll just get a white photograph. And if we make our aperture too small and don't let enough light in, then we get a black, dark photograph. The smaller the pupil, the less light can enter. With shutter speed, we open our camera to try to let all that light in. Of course, if we leave our camera open and we let too much light in over time, the light will eventually make a white photograph. If we open and close our photograph too quickly, we don't let enough light in, and so we'll get a dark photograph. But why would we do this? By leaving our shutter speed open longer, we can get rays of movement, as you can see from these photographs. If we want to catch a moment in time without the blurring effect, then we can make our shutter speed very quickly, something like 1/500th of a second, to get a very sharp photograph of something, even if it's moving very quickly. By experimenting with the shutter speed, you can get a variety of different effects. We use shutter speed and aperture to try to balance the amount of light we want. Depending on what we're trying to get from the photograph, we might have to leave the shutter speed open longer or shorter, or we might try to open up the aperture bigger or smaller. By leaving our aperture open really big, it makes it so the light coming into our eye, into our lens, gets scattered over the film, except for the part that is in focus. If we make the aperture smaller and very tiny, then all the rays coming in from all over the scene have to focus into that aperture and tend to create a very focused photograph in the foreground and in the background, as you can see from this photograph. Of course, by doing that, we have now made a tiny aperture, and if we're outdoors, that's great, we have enough light. But if we are trying to do this at night, now we have to leave our shutter speed open longer to let more light in. It will make everything in focus, but if your friends or objects are moving, then they're going to blur because the shutter speed is open too long. It is a balance. There's also one more tool that will help you with your camera settings. This tool actually, for those who have iPhones or Androids, actually happens automatically. If you ever wonder why at night when you take photographs, your streets and walls look very noisy and such. The reason this happens, as we discussed earlier, the camera is trying to open up its aperture as wide as it can at night so that it can let in the most light. It is also trying to compensate for the darkness by letting the shutter speed stay open longer. If you remember, by letting your shutter speeds open longer, you'll get a blurring of your friends or subject matter. Instead of letting the shutter speed stay open for long, the ability to change the ISO of the camera will make the film or the digital sensor more sensitive to light. Unfortunately, the side effect is more noise. So this is a low ISO, usually used for daylight or well-lit situations. However, if your situation is very dark and you cannot let the shutter speed stay open for very long, you will have to make your ISO a lot higher. This might be an ISO of about 800 or 1000. Of course, the problem is the noisy photograph.